and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. I'm Reagan King and joined as always by my good friend and co-host Simon Barrett as we discuss this week the ongoing onslaught of a liberal regime in Canada. Justin Trudeau, for many years alongside his government, have been seeking to impose particular draconian legislation which is actively stamping out the free expression of the gospel. Latest legislation that has been proposed looks at the possibility of stamping out hate speech, but insidiously involves legislation and criteria that would seriously hinder the freedom of expression and indeed the freedom of religion. This will have doubtless a massive impact on Christians, evangelism, pastoral practice, even private prayer. So this is what we're going to be discussing this evening, and we're going to be joined especially by a good guest who is Dr. Joseph Boot, has firsthand experience of this draconian setup in Canada, Simon, but really quite troubling launch into authoritarianism that we've been seeing.
I mean, I think what the Canadian government is doing under the premiership of Justin Trudeau is the most extreme authoritarian legislation being implemented in any Western country, anywhere around the world right now. And this should be a wake-up call to us all in liberal Western democracies to realize that the freedom that we've enjoyed for centuries is now under threat if we follow Canada's lead. I mean, we're talking about changing the entire judiciary. I mean, the whole foundation of the Western legal system was based on the premise that you are innocent until proven guilty. Well, this new hate legislation changes all that on its head. And essentially what it also does is that you can be arrested for a pre-crime. Right. If a judge considers you capable of committing hate crimes, you can be arrested.
I'm afraid that you might commit one, and so I report you, and the judge, if he feels subjectively that you might be a potential protagonist of what that judge deems to be a hate crime, you could go to prison. Yeah,
I mean, firstly, you'd be under house arrest, then you'd be given a tag, and anyone that you denied alcohol and drugs because they feel that would loosen your mouth. You end up saying more hatred stuff. But essentially, this is designed and being in a legislative package being sold to the Canadian people on the basis that we will rid Canada of hate crimes, online abuse, bullying, and also deal with genocide and incitement towards genocide as a means of keeping the Canadian population safe from harmful content online. But in reality, this legislation is designed to destroy democracy and destroy any opposition to Justin Trudeau and his progressive liberal agenda that wants to effectively remove freedom and democracy in one of the greatest democratic countries in the world, which is Canada. Truly frightening. I mean, for example, this bill known as C-63, proposed legislation known as the Online Hate Bill, risks weaponizing free speech by putting suspected offenders under house arrest, and is forcing them to wear an electronic monitoring device. They could also face fees and fines up to 20,000 Canadian dollars, or could even go up to 600,000 US Canadian dollars. And also we see that the government in Canada wants to create a Canadian task force that will have the power to investigate real or alleged hate crimes without any accountability, which is driven by their liberal ideology.
Under the newly proposed law, judges will have the power to act against individuals that they deem capable of committing hate crimes in the future. That's something really reminiscent of that film Minority Report. You're looking at the potential, could we say accurately, knowing the depravity of the human heart, that a significant number, if not every single individual on the face of the earth, has that potential to commit some form of deemed hate crime. And certainly how they're defining it, we could see that happening. But the idea that someone has not committed a crime, they are subjectively deemed to be potentially capable of committing that crime, then is arrested because of that potential capability or faces other sanctions, house arrest, whatever, wearing an electronic tag, constant monitoring of actions. And this is truly ushering in some form of dystopia. What's happening in Canada under the premiership of Trudeau does serve as a warning to us, and many do seem to be waking up to it, albeit perhaps far too late, that our freedoms and democracy are under serious threat. And even we could discuss, and maybe at some point we will, depending on where that begins to go, but we have not dissimilar legislation that's on the horizon here. There's discussion, again, over blasphemy laws and extremism laws, and those on the surface we could look at and say, okay, are we against hate? Absolutely. Are we against extremism? Absolutely. Are we against the promotion and provoking of, stirring up of violence? Absolutely. We already have legislation across the Western world. Canada already has legislation in its legal framework that imposes restrictions and that highlights and defines those terminologies that has repercussions and right consequences for that truly dangerous, active promotion of hate and stirring up of violence. But what Canada is doing with this latest proposed legislation, and what we might be seeing here as well under proposals to change definitions and to introduce new legislation, is a framework that makes everything extremely subjective, that could have serious ramifications for those who are holding to a Judeo-Christian biblical framework.
No, absolutely. So let's remind ourselves of how this legislation came about. And this is according to the Canadian Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms. Then they produced a press release under the title Online Harm Acts Threatens Free Expression in Canada. So on the 26th of February, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, Arif Vilanani, introduced Bill C-63, known as the Online Harms Act, in the House of Commons. The Online Harms Act is presented by the government to promote the online safety in Canada and reduce harmful content online. The press release goes on to say that the Online Harms Act would impose severe penalties for online and offline hate speech, including life imprisonment, which is the most severe criminal punishment in Canada. The new legislation would establish a new Digital Safety Commission with power to enforce new regulations created by the federal cabinet. The Canadian Human Rights Commission would require new powers to prosecute and punish non-criminal hate speech. The newly proposed legislation, we're being told by Justin Trudeau, is to force online platforms to remove revenge porn and other consensual sharing of intimate images, content that bullies children, content that sexually victimizes children, content that encourages children to harm themselves, and content that incites violence, terrorism, or hatred. I mean, it sounds good so far, nothing that we wouldn't disagree with. It says this new hate crime is being introduced in the context of the horrific events of October the 7th, the mass terrorist attack on Israel by Hamas. They're saying now that they're saying that Israelis and the Palestinian conflict is being played out on the streets of Canada, with widespread demonstrations raising concern about hate-motivated attacks on Jewish and Muslim communities in Canada. Jewish advocacy groups have called for more police action, saying demonstrators have crossed the line into anti-Semitic and hateful behaviour, very much like here. And pro-Palestinian protesters say they feel vilified, and Muslim organisations are raising concern about people being censored because of their comments about the war.
Now, according to CTV News, the government is saying that only extreme online hate speech would be probed by a human rights body. A chant heard at some protests since the war, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," has been at the center of the debate over where the line is when it comes to hate speech. Some Jewish groups have said it calls for the destruction of Israel, which is something that we have even said on this program, which we continue to believe and maintain it does. The reality is the state of Israel, it lies between the Jordan River, the Mediterranean Sea. That's what the expression refers to, the eradication of Israel, and should therefore be considered hate speech or advocating genocide. Palestinian protesters and other supporters have said it is simply a call for freedom and equality. Last fall, a man whose lawyers said he had chanted the phrase was charged in Calgary with causing a disturbance with a hate motivation. The charge was eventually stayed. The primary focus of the Liberal government's bill is to tackle online hate by introducing a new regulator for social media companies. But it also proposes to reintroduce a section of the Canadian Human Rights Act that would allow people to file complaints against those who post online hate speech. This hate bill legislation intends to bring a life sentence for anyone advocating for genocide, that is a 25-year prison sentence, and a 5-year sentence for inciting hate and propaganda. But really the concerns, Simon, are that this could become a massive festival of subjectivity, where there's no clear parameters, no clear definition, and that this will actually impact and affect the communication of gospel truth, communication of biblical truth as well. And this is where we have to, while recognizing there's a lot about this that sounds good, it could also be very, very negative.
I mean, I think if we look at our own country and our own legislation, so the government's flagship criminal justice bill, for example, we know that there are amendments to that bill to actually decriminalise abortion attached to it. In the same way, we see this legislation being presented to the Canadian people saying we will rid and tackle and confront hate crime, but behind it is a very sinister legislation that imposes to actually remove freedom of expression, freedom of thought, and freedom of speech, and the freedom of religion from the Canadian people, which is one of the key pillars of our democracy and one of our key pillars of institutions. Let's have a look now at Canada's Minister of Justice talking about this crime bill legislation known as the hate bill legislation that the government of Justin Trudeau want to bring about.
To make its case for its new law against harmful internet content, the government turned to those impacted.
I may be one mother,
including this mother whose daughter was sexually assaulted with the images shared online while in kindergarten.
She was told or taught to believe that sex or sexual actions between children and grown-ups was completely acceptable and normal.
Or this black entrepreneur who says she was insulted online.
On a utilisé le mot en haine à volonté.
They called me the N-word repeatedly, she said. The Online Harms Act would recognize 7 categories of harmful content, including content that sexually victimizes a child or re-victimizes a survivor, or is used to bully a child, incites violent extremism or terrorism, or foments hatred.
I'm terrified by the dangers that lurk on the internet for our children. We have rigorous safety standards for things like my son's Lego at home. Yet somehow, none for the most dangerous toy, the screen that is in front of our children's faces.
In order to enforce these new laws, the government is proposing a new digital safety commission. It would have the power to order online platforms to remove content that sexually victimizes a child or intimate images shared without consent within 24 hours.
They took a really measured approach.
This expert, one of many the government consulted, said limiting the scope of that ability was key to preserve freedom of expression elsewhere, but also pointed to one gap in the legislation, how it leaves out private messages.
If you talk to many, who study extremism and in the child protection community, they'll talk about how that's such a key vector for communicating extremist messages and child sexual abuse material.
While one opposition party had its own criticism.
Algorithms are not touched, and algorithms are what delivers the hate online.
So there's much about this that we can sympathize with, that we can look and we can say no one should be abused in any way online. No one should be sharing explicit, indecent images of anyone, much less minors, much less children. No one should be subject to hate speech. However, the difficulty is introduced, Simon, when it comes to particular Judeo-Christian worldviews and perspectives, proclamation of prayers on behalf of individuals who are in a situation where they are not walking according to a Christian framework. It's very likely, and Canada has a very bad history of this previously, that those individuals will come under attack simply for not just saying something, but even thinking something. And that's where the feeling that this person has the potential to say something comes into play and can become a very dangerous thing. Now, here's what the hate crime legislation proposes. According to the Free Speech Union, under the heading House Arrest for People Deemed Likely to Commit Hate Crimes in Justin Trudeau's Canada, Justin Trudeau's government has proposed a draconian new law that risks weaponizing the concept of hate speech, enabling judges to put those suspect of harboring hateful thoughts under house arrest, and establishing a free-to-use compensation complaints scheme that will incentivize woke scolds to target for bankruptcy any Canadians who dissent from progressive orthodoxy. According to the Liberal government, the legislation intends to make the internet safer for children, but Bill C-63, also known as the Online Harms Bill, goes much further than cracking down on cyberbullying and child exploitation, targeting what it describes as hate speech. Canada's proposed new law is underpinned by a remarkably vague, nebulous even, thus easily weaponized, definition of hatred as an emotion that involves detestation or vilification and that is stronger than disdain or dislike. According to the bill, hatred of this kind is fomented in online settings by harmful content, which in turn leads people to commit hate speech. The legislation goes on to define harmful content as content that expresses detestation or vilification of an individual or group of individuals based on their race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, marital status, family status, genetic characteristics, and disability. For greater certainty and for the purposes of defining content that foments hatred, the bill adds that content does not express detestation or vilification solely because it expresses disdain or dislike, or it discredits, humiliates, hurts, or offends. However, the legislation doesn't explain how words like offend, hurt, humiliate, discredit, dislike, disdain, detest, and vilify are to be interpreted, or whether they're embedded within some form of hierarchy of seriousness.
And let's have a look at the consequences for breaking Canada's new hate crime legislation that is currently in the Canadian Parliament. It says, in the context that the bill poses to amend Canada's criminal code, creating a new standalone hate crime offence and granting judges the power to put someone under house arrest if they fear they are likely to engage in harmful content. It goes on to say it's a novel take on the dystopian science fiction concept of a pre-crime. If a judge believes that there are reasonable grounds to fear a future hate crime may be committed, the guilty until proved innocent party would be brought before a provincial court to determine whether they are a probable or a likely offender at some unspecified point in the future to generate hate propaganda. So they're saying offending thought criminal would then have to wear an electronic monitoring device, return to and remain at their place of residence for a particular time, abstain from the consumption of drugs or alcohol, or any other intoxicating substance, presumably just in case such substances loosen their hateful mouths. A failure to comply with these restrictions would result in a prison sentence of up to a year. Justice Minister Varani, who is also the country's Attorney General, described the measure in these Orwellian terms, peace bond, and said he could prove very, very important to restrain the behaviour of someone with a track record of hateful behaviour. but it's all in the interpretation of what is hateful behavior, and you cannot legislate for the human heart. It says, if there is a genuine fear of escalation, then an individual or group could come forward and seek a peace bond against them and to prevent them from doing certain things, he added. What's really critical, as it gives the judge a wonderful range of sentences. He goes on to say that in addition to creating this new criminal category of a pre-hate crime, Bill C-63 establishes the offence of communicating hate speech. To achieve this, it will amend the Canadian Human Rights Act, making online hate speech a discriminatory practice and establishing a tribunal known as the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, which will address complaints of online hate speech, as well as speech perpetuated by other means of telecommunications between individuals. And what's so dangerous as well with this proposed legislation is that, Reagan, you and I can put a social media post out that could be, I don't know, 10, 15 years old, and you could be prosecuted going back all that time for someone who's interpreted a particular message online as being hateful or harmful to them. So if you're in a grievance group, and you are fundamentally opposed to any kind of biblical values, and you want to pursue your left-wing, progressive, liberal agenda, and you see that that biblical Christianity poses a threat, you can say that this person posted this message and this is a hate crime, and you'd be arrested and up against a judge.
Yeah, and this is the problem, that all of this appears to apply retrospectively and retroactively. Anyone can be brought before tribunal for any material posted at any time, regardless of publication date. It doesn't seem that there's any statute of limitations that's introduced as part of this legislation, with anonymous accusations, even secret, and in some cases, undeniably, it would be false testimony being permitted at the tribunal's discretion. And the problem is, this is a process that, beyond that, financially incentivizes complaints at essentially zero cost. There's a freedom to file. Anyone can do this, and the implications for individuals who could be found could be caught afoul of this legislation would be absolutely catastrophic. Of course, there are individuals who are criminals, there are individuals who are hateful, there are people who are extremists, and there are ways of dealing with that. It's already there in the legislation. There already is legislation that is designed to help counteract that. This just seems to be adding a further issue to an already complex problem.
And also, I mean, if for example, give you an example for our viewers as well. So, for example, this wouldn't, if I wanted to pursue a hate crime against you, Reagan, for example, in Canada, you put out a social message, I find that offensive, I consider that a hate crime, I can then go to this court, it won't cost me anything, and they would then bring a case against you as a kind of prosecution, because this is the way it's stacked up, and you could be facing anything between a 20,000 Canadian fine or 600,000 Canadian fine. So let's have a look now at this excellent CBN news report that tackles this new hate crime legislation being introduced in Canada.
Remember the restrictive measures enacted in Canada by Justin Trudeau during the COVID-19 pandemic? Police shuttered churches and arrested pastors for defying government health orders. Well, now opponents of a proposed law known as Bill C-367 contend the legislation would deprive Canadians of their right to religious freedom. Proponents of C-367 contend it is a response to anti-Semitism, while Christians say essentially those who share biblical views of sexuality or other matters publicly could face arrest for hate crimes. We're here with more is Jeff King, president of International Christian Concern, ICC. Jeff, please explain what's happening in Canada. It seems well-intentioned, but you believe the law would pose a grave danger to religious freedom.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. It will. And it's not, these laws don't come about by accident. So this thing is advanced. There's been a whole series of bad laws passed previously in Canada that brought forward hate speech laws. Always a bad idea in democracy. It's always a way to protect a special interest group and to actually attack political opponents. So basically, the hate speech laws that were passed previously, the Christians were told to be, hey, calm down, everything's fine. There's protections for you in there. And those protections revolved around free speech and religious thought. And so basically, if the Bible says this, if the Quran says this, and you're saying, something based on that, you're protected. That's religious free speech. This bill, believe it or not, just like was tried to pass in the United States, the Equality Act, this bill would dismantle those protections. It's a monstrous step back for religious freedom. It's a dismantling of religious freedom in Canada.
Well, this bill had a first reading in the House of Commons, I believe, last November. So where does it stand at this point? It seems stalled a bit.
Well, we're in the sausage making, so it's where is anybody's guess? Basically, if Trudeau supporters get behind it, it'll move forward. The whole idea is to bring enough press to this. Most people are asleep. They don't even know what's going on. So the whole idea is to bring enough press to this, to wake people up, to shout, to call their representatives, and to do more if they have to. Because what will happen is if the bill is exposed and what it's really trying to do, the members should back off.
Well, we all want to protect people from hate crimes, whether they're LGBTQ, Jews, Muslims, Christians, but you believe this goes too far. It wasn't too long ago. Remember, the churches were ordered closed. Police arrested pastors like Tim Stevens in Calgary for keeping his church open during COVID. Truckers saw their bank accounts frozen when they staged a protest in Ottawa and the Ambassador Bridge. And then Catholic high school student, remember him, Josh Alexander, he was expelled for sharing biblical views of transgenderism. So what do you believe is going on right now with freedom in Canada?
Well, look, I said it, I'll say it again. These laws don't come about by accident. They're not accidentally bad laws. They're typically dreamed up, in the bowels of a political party, and it smells of banana republic. I'm telling you, these things are used to put knives into the hands of one political party to attack their enemies. That's exactly what will happen. And people who believe in religious freedom, who believe in democracy, atheist, agnostic, left, right, it doesn't matter. You should be alarmed. These laws always protect us from one another. And that's what, in the U.S., that's what our founders saw so clearly. We all, at a very base level, need to be protected from one another because we will attack those who are different. And it doesn't matter if you're left or right, or it's just human nature. And so those laws, and especially the religious freedom laws, are so potent. They're such a potent force for democracy. They are enshrined. They have to be protected. They have to be guarded.
And you're concerned about those political views drifting south of the border, right here to the USA. Most people would say, well, that's Canada. That couldn't possibly happen in the United States. We have a constitutional guarantee of religious freedom here. So what are the chances similar laws could be implemented right here in the good old USA?
Well, Gary, it's 100% because it was already tried with the Equality Act under the Biden administration. Complete nightmare, the exact same strategy. And let me tell you how this goes. I've been doing religious freedom around the world for 20 years, and so I'm familiar with every game that every Marxist dictator or despot tries or Islamic radical tries. So these laws, it's always this. Out of one side of the mouth, the politician says, we have religious freedom in our country. Oh, please. And those laws stand on the books, but they're ignored because, on the other hand, on the other side of their mouth, what they say is, we have religious freedom, but that's for your own home. Get out of the public square. That's exactly what happens under Xi and China and Vietnam. All these places, the worst places for religious freedom, including North Korea. There's no place in the public square. You can think about your Christianity. You can practice it in your own home. Don't spread it. Don't share it. Everything will be fine. You see, we have religious freedom.
Okay, Jeff King, president of ICC, that's International Christian Concern. It's good talking with you again, Jeff. We always appreciate the work you do. God bless you.
Thank you, Gary.
This evening, we're joined by a special guest, Dr. Joseph Boot of the Ezra Institute. Welcome to the program, Dr. Boot.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, a couple of years ago, we had you on and you were sharing with us a little bit about the authoritarian agenda of the Canadian state. Particularly, the topic then had to do with the freezing of bank accounts and the debacle surrounding Canadian truckers and their convictional, conscientious stance over COVID. Have things improved since that time? What are some of the changes that you've seen in your work and ministry in Canada after that incident?
Yes, well, unfortunately, things have not changed. In fact, they've not changed for the better under the current regime, let's call it, the Liberal regime in Canada. In fact, I've been quite surprised over the last 12 months to see the international headlines that Canada has been making, both in the United States and here in the United Kingdom. Only a couple of days ago, I was reading a major piece in The Telegraph about the authoritarian structure now that is being, legal structure that's being built in the Canadian state. The current Prime Minister, of course, Justin Trudeau, and his Liberals, in partnership with the NDP, which is led by Jagmeet Singh, have been working together on these legislative reforms. Although I have to say that the Conservative government hasn't, the Conservative opposition hasn't actually stood firmly against most of it. But since the time we last spoke, things have actually gone from bad to worse from a legislative point of view, and I can illustrate for you some of those bills in just a moment. But in terms of the big picture, I would say things have gotten significantly worse from the political and social point of view for Canadians in the past 2 years, especially in regard to freedom of expression and freedom of speech, and it has been sufficient to interest foreign journalists writing major pieces now on the authoritarian, even Orwellian kind of structures that are being built to chill freedom of speech and freedom of expression in Canada.
Joe, it's a pleasure to have you on Behind Headlines, particularly as you can give us real insight into what is happening in Canada. Would you say with this new legislation known as BC 63, the online harms bill, it will actually be used to weaponize free speech? And just share with us the full authoritarian nature of this legislation. And would you say this was the worst legislation in terms of freedom that we've seen in any Western country throughout the entire world?
Yes, Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act that you're referring to, I think is probably the most frightening piece of legislation that we've seen tabled, not just in Canada, but probably anywhere in the Western world in recent years. You have to remember that the various bills that have actually been tabled in Canada over the last 18 months or so, you can see them being constructed so that they actually work together to effectively stamp out freedom of expression. And it's obvious who the real targets of this legislation actually is. So very quickly, first of all, we had Bill C-4, and that was the conversion therapy ban, the definition of which you could drive a bus through. Almost anything could be defined as conversion therapy. Even the desire to lessen somebody's desire in terms of gender dysphoria or same-sex desire was being deemed and is deemed now in Canada criminal. If an adult, a consenting adult, were to come to you as a Christian pastor in Canada and ask for counsel because they've got unwanted same-sex desires, and you said, yes, sure, come to my office, next 5 Wednesdays, and that was taken to the courts and you were prosecuted, you'd go to jail for 5 years as a pastor just helping a consenting adult. Bill C-63, what this particular bill seeks to do is introduce a new legislation into the criminal code regarding the promotion of hatred. It's done in the name of protecting children. It actually introduces a life sentence for somebody promoting genocide online. Now, all of us here would not be for the promotion of genocide. But the difficulty, of course, is that the definition of what is genocide or genocidal, for example, a lot of people talk about what is happening in Israel and Gaza right now as a genocide against Palestinians. Well, could that be captured if you are actually not for the pro-Palestinian cause? It also adds a 5-year prison sentence for the basically promotion of anything that's deemed to be hatred. So this is section 319 of the Criminal Code that's being amended here in Bill C-63, and it's threatening 5 years for promoting hate, life imprisonment for promoting genocide. And of course, what happens when this kind of legislation gets introduced is more and more people want their particular views protected by the legislation. When you see that bill alongside Bill C-367, which was introduced last November, this is a bill to repeal the protections for those who have a genuine religious belief, a genuine theological conviction, let's say about human identity and sexuality. The Criminal Code originally protected religious speech about those issues, that couldn't be deemed a public incitement to hatred. This bill, which was introduced in November, which has gone a bit quiet at the moment, but no doubt it will be pushed through in due course, at least that, or a version of it, I have no doubt. It'll probably be renumbered and renamed, is an attempt to remove any protection for religious speech as inciting hatred. So you can see that Bill C-63 and C-367 working together would basically criminalize Christian doctrine, Christian speech, not just Christian pastoral care now, which is already criminalized under Bill C-4 for people struggling with their identity and their sexuality. So this is a truly terrifying piece of legislation. It's a terrifying legislative framework that's being set up, and the goal is to shut people up.
And it seems that the risk is that all of this can be interpreted in a very subjective way. Lawmakers, those in the judiciary, can superimpose their own subjective definitions of this onto the individual stood in front of them. Isn't there already some form of legislation in place to appropriately deal with legitimate hate attacks?
Yes, of course. There's already legislation in place that would deal with those who are inciting violence and terror, promoting terrorism, and so forth. And there's already very restrictive legislation in place to deal with the promotion of so-called hatred. Again, this is all about Orwellian policing of people's emotions, people's thoughts, and people's speech. So this kind of punitive criminal threats are not needed at all. The police have more than enough tools already to deal with things that are genuinely a threat to a free and democratic society. But that is clearly not what this is about. This is about stamping out political opposition. It's about stamping out the worldview of specifically Christians in Canada. And these things are not evenly applied. I mean, for example, Islamists have been engaged in all kinds of protests and so forth recently in Canada, in the major cities. Recently, a journalist was arrested on the street for trying to interview them because they claimed they were about to pray on the sidewalk. And the journalist said, well, this is the King's Highway. I've got a right to be here as well. It wasn't the protesters who were arrested. It was the journalist. These are the kind of things that are happening, and protections are there for the religious minorities, but there's no interest in protecting Christians. Now, with respect to Bill C-4, which I mentioned, the conversion therapy ban, just be aware, which happened last year, you should be aware that not a single MP in the Canadian House of Parliament, in the Commons, voted against this. Not a single Conservative MP registered a vote against Bill C-4. So it's not as though in Canada you have a powerful opposition that is speaking openly and strongly about these issues and to these issues. Not a single MP in the House voted against Bill C4, and that's a very, very scary place to be.
Joe, what are your thoughts on how the Canadian government, through this very dangerous and insidious legislation they're looking to introduce into law, is actually changing centuries-old our legal system in the West, that you are innocent until proven guilty, but with this new legislation, you are guilty until proven innocent. Just share with us as well how you can also be arrested for potentially committing a hate crime without actually committing a crime in the first place, which smacks of science fiction, very much similar to something of the film Minority Report that came out in 2002.
Yeah. Well, again, you know, you have to read these things to believe them. I mean, I was in the United States recently and speaking to American Christians and mentioning some of these things. They literally cannot believe it. They cannot believe that these things are happening just north of the border in a Western democracy. You have to remember there were significant changes in Canada in the late 1960s, just as there were across much of the West. But it was during the late 60s that a new kind of liberal, progressive regime and a new kind of thinking came in with the hard left in Canada. Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, was the architect of what we call the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was really to supersede the British North America Act. And so in 1982, a new charter was introduced, and Section 1 and 2 deal with the issue of freedoms. We soon learned during the COVID era what the fundamental freedoms of the Charter in Section 2 were actually worth. Pretty much nothing. The Section 1 rights of the government to take away people's freedoms trump them. But what you have in Canada now effectively is that it is the judiciary, unelected judges, that are really making law. So when you ask the question about interpretation and the way in which these laws can be employed and used, it is down to basically progressive liberal justices to effectively, in many cases, make the law. I mean, Parliament just keeps punting these things. Take, for example, the euthanasia. You know, Canada now has very open euthanasia law, struck down all the laws against euthanasia in terms of Section 7 of the Charter. From this month, new legislation has been introduced so that minors can be euthanized in Canada. So what's happening in Canada is that basically an unelected judiciary increasingly is really interpreting and effectively making law in Canada, not the House. And with Bill C-63, you actually have a provision in this bill, and I think this is what you were alluding to, for a kind of pre-crime. So a judge could literally order you to be placed under house arrest if you are considered to be at risk of promoting a hate crime.
Joe, finally, is the nation of Canada waking up? Is the Canadian media concerned about this almost authoritarian legislation being imposed upon one of our great democracies in the world, that is Canada? Is there a wake-up amongst Christians, amongst conservatives, about how insidious and how dangerous this legislation is, and how other Western nations could actually follow Canada's lead if this is not stamped out now?
Well, certainly the piece of legislation that you just referred to, you know, especially the pre-crime elements of being placed under house arrest because of the possibility that you might be at risk of, in terms of the judge's assessment of committing a crime. Some of these things do raise eyebrows, of course, but in general terms, you tend to find that with each new piece of legislation, people say, well, it can't get any worse than this. And yet somehow it does. Overall, I would say that there are pockets of resistance. There are some churches. There are some small movements that are raising concerns about this. Not all parts of Canada are equally progressive and liberal. You do have in the Western Canada, in Alberta, a little more resistance to some of these things. But overall, I would say the level of resistance is weak. There is not a strong public discourse. There are not visible major media and news outlets that are conservative like we have in the United States and in England. And that's a whole bunch of legislation that really shut those down. You have restrictive laws around access to news, even on social media. So that was happening last year as well, of what Canadians can access on social media and what media companies have to pay to have access to the Canadian audience. So overall, I would say that no, there is not strong resistance to these things. There are pockets, there are faithful people, there are faithful Christian leaders, there are some faithful churches, but this is a major threat. And I don't think that for the most part, the rest of the West has yet woken up to the extent of the authoritarian structures that are being built in Canada and the threat that they represent. As I say, there are some articles coming out, there is some news focusing on it, but not enough. And the Canadian government needs to be placed under international pressure, in my view, by Western democracies so that it actually climbs down from some of these things and that changes are made so that freedoms are protected in Canada. Those who are fighting for freedom there are isolated, and there are not many of them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boot, for your expertise and your commentary on this. And viewers, you'll want to be praying for Dr. Boot and the Ezra Institute and the important work that they undertake. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Well, really, truly helpful to have that first-hand perspective from Dr. Joseph Boot there. And
who is Canadian, who spent a lot of time in Canada, knows the political situation as well as the spiritual situation in Canada as well. So it's a great guest, so well done, thank you.
He's experienced it firsthand, and it's one of those things that even as he was talking, it was very helpful unpacking of some of those repercussions. You were leaning in particularly to this subjective element that anyone can essentially report an individual and that they can be afraid that this individual is going to share something against them or is going to do something that upsets. This is the Online Harms Act, and if it passed into law, it would add something called Section 810.012 to the Criminal Code, permitting preemptive violations of personal liberty when no crime has been committed. This repudiates centuries of legal tradition. You highlighted that. This was just a complete overhaul of everything in that setting where punishment has always been reserved for something someone has actually done, something that has actually been committed, a crime that has actually been committed, not what a person might do. So the idea that this legislation could impact something that someone subjectively thinks you might do is truly frightening.
Also, the Online Harms Act provides an order of the Digital Safety Commission may be converted into an order of a federal court and enforce like court order. This could result in people operating social media services being fined and imprisoned for contempt of court if they refuse to censor Canadian speech.
This Online Harms Act as well, if it's passed into law, could have very severe ramifications. It gets more and more serious as you go through. First of all, it could start with wearing an ankle bracelet, which is an electronic monitoring device, obeying a curfew, staying at home, determined by a judge. We've talked about the alcohol, drugs, or both, providing bodily substances to confirm abstinence, not communicating with certain designated persons, not going to certain places as determined by the judge, surrendering her or his legally owned and legally acquired firearms as well. In other words, a citizen who has not committed any crime can be subjected to one or more or all of the above conditions just because someone fears that that person might commit a speech crime in the future. Further, if the person who's committed no crime fails to agree to these court-ordered violations of her or his personal liberty, she or he could be sentenced for up to 2 years in prison. But that's not it, Simon. The most troubling element of this legislation is in relation to the potential that one could face life imprisonment simply for the words that they speak.
Yeah, if you call for a genocide, and that depends on the government's definition of genocide, you could find yourself in prison for saying that you want to bring about a genocide. It's horrific, yes, but a genocide hasn't committed, so why does that deserve a life sentence of 25 years?
Well, look, when people are calling for the eradication of Israel by chanting from the river to the sea, I know that there are some people who have no idea what they're saying or idea of what they're meaning. They're just going along with the chant. On the other hand, someone who is in favor of Israel could find themselves underneath a judge who is subjectively saying, well, they are advocating for a state of Israel. And so this cuts both ways. And just as I think both of us have enough sense and compassion and grace in the situation, as horrific as we find the chant from the river to the sea, neither of us are calling for the life imprisonment of individuals chanting it.
Or if you support Israel and Israel's IDF operations in Gaza to destroy Hamas,
right,
that would be considered a genocide by liberal progressives. And if under that kind of circumstances, by supporting the IDF, you could then be supporting genocide and then find yourself having a 25-year prison sentence, which is life in prison in Canada. But what was also so troubling about this new online hate bill is the fact that the Online Harms Act, if passed into law, would give new powers to the federal cabinet, not the government, the cabinet of Justin Trudeau, to pass regulations which some force of law as legislation passed by Parliament that places prohibitions or obligations on social media services. This includes passing regulations that impose fines or other consequences, the removal of a license or the shutting down of a website for non-compliance. In other words, you don't agree with the government of Justin Trudeau, you'll be shut down. New regulations can be created by a federal cabinet in its sole discretion and do not need to be debated, voted, or approved by Parliament. I mean, this is effectively an authoritarian takeover and a suspension of the justice system in Canada. It goes on to say that parliamentary proceedings are public. Any political party or even one single MP can raise public awareness about a bill that she or he disagrees with and can mobilise public opinion to that bill, not so with regulators, which are deliberated in secret by a federal cabinet that comes into force without any public consultation or debate. This is an authoritarian takeover.
Apart from a federal election held once every 4 years, there's no meaningful way to hold such a cabinet to account for the draconian censorship of social media services by way of regulations and the harsh penalties that may be imposed for hosting harmful content. Again, subjectively defined. The federal cabinet can also decide what number of users the social media service needs to have in order to trigger federal regulation of content, or the federal cabinet can simply designate a social media service as regulated regardless of the number of its users. But there already is legislation in place to deal with hate crimes. So the question has to be asked, beyond an attempt to subversively introduce this insidious ideology, what's the point of this legislation? The legislation already exists.
It's total control. Total control of the population. It's recommending the suspension of justice in Canada and giving the federal cabinet, which is Justin Trudeau's cabinet, totalitarian powers over the population in Canada. And this is absolutely frightening. I mean, this follows a sequence of events. So we saw that Canada faced the harshest draconian measures during COVID-19, with many pastors being arrested. And then we saw, for example, with the Freedom Truckers, their bank accounts suspended, and those that are raising money and supporting them found that their bank accounts were actually frozen by the government of Justin Trudeau. And now we see their intention to legislate hate crimes with the new online hate bill legislation, which you cannot legislate for the human heart. only Jesus Christ can change the human heart and to live righteously. So effectively, this is a very dangerous legislation that will be used to enslave people and not free them. In actual fact, it will actually generate hatred and do everything that this bill says it wants to combat, because people will then feel that they're living in fear and tyranny.
The hate crime legislation is undeniably authoritarian in its nature, and frankly, Simon, is an abuse of power by Trudeau and his government. It goes against the very foundations of a healthy Western society, of Western justice system that's been built upon the concept that you're innocent until proven guilty. And this hate crime legislation would convict or arrest people the government or court believe could possibly commit a hate crime in the future. And as legislation is ideologically driven, with anyone who opposes the secular, humanist, liberal, progressive agenda of Canada being targeted by this legislation. Used to target Bible-believing Christians, as legislation existing already is being used, this will only increase and will affect those who are standing up for that which is good, right, and true. So it's time to speak up against the proposed hate speech legislation, because really, Simon, this could be coming to, and I say is coming to, our own society. Well, that's it from myself and Simon for this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. Bless you, and we ask that you continue to pray into these critical issues. We'll see you next time, God willing, for another edition of Behind the Headlines.